Look, it's alarming what we're hearing from Kristalina Georgieva. A wake-up call, some economists are saying. But is the head of the IMF really telling us anything we didn't already know?
Not particularly. We knew, of course, that there's been a slowdown in the world economy over the last few months. And you've seen that also in terms of confidence, business confidence most generally in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, in other words, the more advanced nations. We're already showing that there had been a decline over a period in confidence for the future, mainly, of course, because of the impact of the war in Ukraine and the increase in input costs, which is really, really very significant across the globe. And that, of course, has affected the willingness of businesses to go out and spend anything at all on sort of capital investment. And also, of course, individuals whose cost of living has increased very substantially and wages have not kept up with that inflation. And that's really at the center of what is underlying the reduced forecast, if you like, although we haven't seen the revisions yet. There will be more at the end of January, but the revisions that the International Monetary Fund is talking about are very much based on those principles, added to the fact that they are worried, in fact, even though they say that we need to do something to tackle inflation. It's an international issue, and I'm not sure whether we can, in each country, do anything very much about it in the short term. But lots of central banks are now raising interest rates in order to reduce demand in the economy and control inflation, and that looks synchronized, even though it's not coordinated. And the World Bank and the IMF worry that this synchronization of interest rate increases is going to affect both the developed nations and the developing ones.
And let's talk about that, because there'll be some economies that are more vulnerable than others. Where do you think might bear the brunt of all this?
Well, of course, when you look at resilience to what is going on in Ukraine, well, obviously the US is a bit stronger. And yes, there's talk about recession there too. But in reality, we've still got to be convinced that this is indeed going to happen. Europe is quite affected by this, mainly because of the gas supply issue from Russia, which, of course, is something that they're dealing with right now. Cuts of those supplies have changed completely, even the industrial policy in Europe, and they're very vulnerable, even though recently they seem to have stabilized in terms of their industrial production, and confidence isn't really declining. In fact, in some countries it's improving. So it's interesting to look at Europe, but it's definitely affected already. They're trying to reduce energy consumption. That's going to affect quite a lot of areas of production in the future. But then, of course, there's China, where we know full well that the whole COVID issue is also one that is worrying the IMF in terms of what it means for other countries in the region exporting to China. Is that going to lead to yet another slowdown in growth for the short term? But most expectations are that after those first few months, we might see a bounce back in China and elsewhere. So yes, the year overall may not be very good, but we might see this pattern. Bad early on and an improvement later.
You're saying that in the short term you don't expect much to change. So what's it going to take? And when might we see a reversal of the world's fortune? I mean, you and I, we've talked about consumer confidence before, about that being key, and certainly to governments to getting back on track. I mean, what's your take?
My take has to do hugely with what happens to the rate of inflation. As inflation starts coming down, and there are signs that it is, unless there is an escalation again of the war in Ukraine, what we're likely to be seeing is a continuation of recent trends. Oil prices stabilizing, possibly coming down. They've already come down, of course, quite a lot. Gas prices have fallen quite substantially in the last few months, so that's good news. And also, of course, we've seen food prices reducing over a period of time, international food prices. I think it's been 7 or 8 months when those prices have either not increased but actually also fallen in various months. So that's good news. The problem is it takes a little bit of time for some of those impacts to be reflected in what the consumers are paying at the shops, for example, and what the input costs are for producers. So that's really what is going to determine, I think, whether that business and consumer confidence comes back, how fast inflation starts falling, and what the reaction of central banks is likely to be to that.